This is the story of Julian Cross and his wife, Natalie Cross. They had built something that looked, from the outside, like a life most people would recognize as successful. 11 years of marriage, a house in a quiet Portland neighborhood. 2 incomes that never quite touched the ceiling of what they'd imagined for themselves, but came close enough not to complain about. Julian was the kind of man who noticed everything and said very little about most of it. A quality Natalie had once called steady and later began calling distant, though she never said that last word to his face. The tension between them was not the kind that announces itself. It lived in the 3-second pauses before answering simple questions, in the way she tilted her phone screen whenever he walked past. What Julian would eventually uncover was not simply a betrayal of the romantic kind, though it was that too. It was the discovery that the person he had loved, carefully and imperfectly, had never entirely arrived at the life they shared, that some part of her had always been standing at a door he didn't know existed, one hand already on the handle. The Tuesday night ritual was this. Julian cooked, Natalie set the table, and they ate while one of them described some frustration from work that the other half listened to while finishing their food. It was not unhappy. That was the thing Julian would think about later. How thoroughly it was not unhappy, and how that was somehow not the same as being okay. He made pasta that night. Nothing complicated. A simple aglio e olio he'd learned from a YouTube video 2 years ago and had since made 30-odd times, adjusting the garlic, the heat, the ratio of pasta water. Natalie had said once, early on, that it was the best thing he made. She didn't say things like that anymore, but she still ate it and he still noticed. "Henderson wants me in Chicago next week," she said, twirling pasta without looking up. 3 days, maybe 4. That's the 3rd time this quarter. It's a client relationship. They like FaceTime. Julian nodded. He poured himself more water and thought briefly about asking which client, and then decided not to, and then registered the fact that he'd decided not to, which was itself a kind of information. Natalie worked in financial consulting, a phrase Julian had long ago stopped trying to explain to people at dinner parties. She managed relationships with institutional clients, moved between meetings and reports and quarterly reviews, traveled when required. She was good at her job. He knew that not from anything she described in detail, but from the way she carried herself on work calls, the particular stillness that came over her, a competence so internalized it had become a kind of posture. He worked in urban planning for the city. Slower work, the kind that mattered in increments too small to feel like progress most of the time. He liked it. Mostly. They cleaned up together, moving around each other in the kitchen with the fluency of long practice. She rinsed. He loaded the dishwasher. There was a moment when she reached past him for the dish soap and her hair brushed his shoulder, and he thought she might stop, stay in that inch of closeness for a breath. She didn't. She stepped back and rinsed her hands and said she was going to take a bath. "Long day," he said. "Yeah," she said. Just that. He watched a documentary about Scandinavian architecture that she'd added to their shared watch list weeks ago. She never came down to watch it with him. Their friend group had contracted over the years, the way friend groups do after 40, not from falling out but from dispersal, from children and relocating and the general entropy of adult life. What remained was a loose cluster of 4 or 5 couples who saw each other at birthday dinners and occasionally on weekends if someone remembered to organize something. Marcus Webb was Julian's oldest friend, a high school connection that had survived college and career detours and the specific strain of watching each other become different people than they'd expected. He was a contractor now, built and renovated houses, had a daughter in middle school and a calm, uncomplicated marriage to a woman named Priya, who laughed easily and didn't make anyone feel like they were being evaluated. Marcus came by on Saturday afternoon to return a drill he'd borrowed. He stayed for a beer, and they sat on the back porch in the September light while Natalie was upstairs, ostensibly on a call. "She seems tired," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Long quarter," Julian said. Marcus turned his beer in his hands and said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of comment. "You guys okay?" he asked eventually. Julian looked at the yard, the dry patch near the fence he kept meaning to reseed. The crooked bird feeder Natalie had bought at a farmer's market 3 summers ago. Yeah, he said. We're fine. Marcus nodded like he believed him, which Julian appreciated. After Marcus left, Julian went upstairs. He could hear Natalie's voice through the bedroom door, low, measured, professional. And he stood in the hallway for just a moment, long enough to register that the cadence of her talking was slightly different than her work voice, looser somehow, before he turned and went back downstairs. He didn't mention it. Not then. That night, lying beside her in the dark, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, he found himself cataloging small things. The way she'd angled away from his hand when he touched her shoulder. The slight delay before she responded to his questions. The phone, always face down now. He didn't let himself interpret any of it. He filed it away instead, the way he always had, carefully and in silence, and without knowing what he was eventually filing it toward. October arrived and the mornings got dark earlier. Julian started waking before his alarm, 4:55, lying in the gray light while Natalie slept. He'd never been an anxious person. He didn't recognize at first that what was happening to him was something adjacent to anxiety. It presented instead as a kind of heightened attention. He noticed things. He cataloged. She was on her phone more, not in an obvious, compulsive way, not the zombie scroll of someone numbing out, but in a deliberate, purposeful way. Like she was managing something, she'd step out of rooms to answer calls. She'd excuse herself from dinner to respond to a message and come back with her expression slightly reorganized, like she'd just concluded a negotiation. He asked her once casually who she'd been texting. Just Renata, she said. Renata was a colleague. Julian had met her twice. He said okay. He meant it, or tried to. One evening he came home to find the house empty and a note on the kitchen island. Running late, picking up groceries, back by 7. The note itself was unremarkable. What wasn't unremarkable was that she'd never left him a handwritten note before. In 11 years of marriage, everything had been texts. He held the note and understood, slowly, that she must have been in too much of a hurry, or too complicated a state of mind, to reach for her phone, which meant she'd been startled into analog behavior, which meant something had unsettled her enough to reach for a pen. She came home at 7 with groceries and a practiced ease, and he didn't say anything about the note. They had dinner with another couple, the Aldersons, Reed and Camille, the following weekend. Camille was Natalie's friend first, sharp-tongued in an affectionate way. A landscape architect with opinions about everything and the authority to hold them. Reed sold insurance and seemed largely comfortable with being the quieter presence in his own marriage. Over the second bottle of wine, the conversation wandered into a discussion about identity. How much people changed, how much they stayed the same beneath their changes. I think most people are exactly who they were at 20, Camille said. They just get better at hiding it. Or worse, Natalie said. She said it quickly, without seeming to think about it, and then took a sip of her wine with a particular deliberateness, as though returning herself to the room. Julian looked at her. She didn't meet his eyes. There's something clarifying about getting older, Julian said. He was talking to the table, not to anyone specifically. You get a clearer picture of what people are actually like versus what they were presenting. Reed nodded agreeably. Camille said something about her mother. Natalie refilled her glass. Later, driving home, the car was quiet for a long time. Then Natalie said, "What did you mean by that, what you said at dinner?" "Nothing in particular." She turned to look out the window. "Okay." Another long silence. The rain had started, light and steady. "Julian." She said his name like a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. "Yeah, do you think you know me?" He kept his eyes on the road. He thought about how to answer honestly, without answering entirely. "I think I know who you're with me," he said. She was quiet for the rest of the drive. It was 3 nights later that he walked into the bathroom. He'd come upstairs for ibuprofen, a headache that had built slowly across the evening. Natalie was already in bed. The bathroom was hers in the practical sense. She took longer getting ready, kept more things on the shelves, had arranged the counter with a system he'd never fully decoded. He opened the medicine cabinet, found the ibuprofen, and then, reaching to close the mirrored door, noticed that the small decorative panel beside the mirror, a wooden piece she'd mounted 2 or 3 years ago to hold hooks for her hair accessories, was slightly ajar. Not open, just slightly ajar, with a gap that hadn't been there before. He was the kind of man who noticed things. He pushed the panel gently. It swung on a small hinge. Behind it, in the shallow space between the wall studs, was a phone in a gray case. Not her regular phone. He knew her regular phone, the rose gold case with the small scratch near the camera. This one was gray. Older model, the screen was dark. He stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the sound of his own breathing and, distantly, the creak of the house settling. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it the way you look at something when you're giving yourself the last possible moment of not knowing. Then he heard Natalie's footsteps. She'd gotten up, probably for water, and she appeared in the bathroom doorway. She looked at him. She looked at the open panel. She went perfectly, completely still. It wasn't the stillness of guilt exactly, it was something more complicated. It was the stillness of a person watching something they'd been dreading finally arrive, and finding that all their preparation for this moment had somehow not accounted for the reality of it. Julian looked at her and said quietly, "What is this, Natalie?" And she stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and said nothing. And somewhere underneath his steadiness, underneath the careful cataloging and the deliberate silences and 11 years of noticing everything and saying very little about most of it, Julian felt something shift, something old and load-bearing, and understood that whatever came next would not leave either of them where they'd been standing. He didn't take the phone from the wall. That seemed important to him. Not touching it, not yet. He closed the panel and they moved, wordlessly, to the kitchen, the way people do when they need a room that isn't a bedroom, when the proximity of a bed makes certain conversations feel too intimate for what they've become. Natalie sat at the island. Julian stood on the other side of it, his arms loose at his sides, and waited. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Tonight." She looked down at the countertop. "I mean, about something being off." "A while," he said. "Months." She absorbed this. "And you didn't say anything. Neither did you." The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the last of the evening rain tapped against the kitchen window. Julian was aware of wanting very badly not to raise his voice, and of how little effort it actually took, which told him something about how much of what he was feeling was not rage. "I need you to tell me," he said. "All of it." She looked up at him then. Not defiantly, not with the careful blankness of someone managing their exposure. She looked at him with something like exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something too long. "There's a lot," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I don't know where to start." Start anywhere. Her name had not always been Natalie Cross. Before that, before Julian, before Portland, before the version of herself she'd assembled in her late 20s with something approaching conviction, she had been Natalie Forsyth. And before that, for a brief period in her early 20s that she had never discussed with anyone, she had used another name entirely, tied to a life she'd walked out of so completely she'd believed it was sealed behind her. The phone was for that life, not an affair, not in the traditional sense. What it contained, what she explained to him in pieces across 2 hours in the quiet kitchen, was a network of communication she'd maintained for years, messages with a man named Garrett, who had known her in that earlier life, accounts that weren't in her name, a structure she'd built and maintained in parallel, invisible like a load-bearing wall inside a finished room. She'd taken money from joint accounts, not large amounts, not at once. A careful, patient bleed over years into an account Garrett managed for her. The plan, she used that word with a care that suggested she'd thought about how it would land, had been to have the capacity to leave. Not necessarily to leave, to have the capacity. To have an exit that didn't require anyone's permission, including mine, Julian said, including yours. He looked at her face, at the specific composition of it, the guilt and the something else that wasn't quite defiance but wasn't quite shame either. Why? She pressed her fingers flat against the countertop. Because I've spent my whole life making sure I had a way out, she said. Because I don't know how to be in something without also knowing I can leave it. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you never trusted this. It sounds like I never trusted myself inside of this. She looked at him steadily. Those aren't the same thing, Julian. He considered that. He didn't agree with it entirely, but he understood it wasn't entirely wrong either. Here is where something strange happened. They had gone quiet. One of those long, pressurized silences that fills a room after something true has been said. Natalie was looking at the table. Julian was looking somewhere past her shoulder. And then she said in a voice that was slightly disconnected from the room, slightly apart from herself, I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something. Julian blinked. What? She shook her head, something flickering across her face. Confusion, or the recognition of having briefly gone somewhere she couldn't explain. Nothing, she said. I don't know why I said that. He looked at her for a moment longer than the silence required. Then he said, okay. And they returned to where they'd been as though the seam had closed. Were you going to leave? Julian asked. Actually leave. She thought about this for long enough that it felt like its own kind of answer. I don't know, she said finally. I don't think so, but I needed to believe I could. That's a hard thing to live next to. I know. I mean, for me. He said it quietly, without accusation. Knowing that, it changes the shape of things. I know, Julian. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the wet street. The amber glow of the lamp at the corner. The ordinary nighttime surface of the neighborhood. He thought about the bird feeder, the dry patch of yard, the Tuesday pasta. 30 odd times. I need you to leave tonight, he said. Not permanently. I need the house to myself. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize again. She went upstairs, and he heard her moving around, careful, quiet, and then the sound of a bag being packed, and then her footsteps on the stairs, and then the front door. He stood at the window for a long time after her car was gone. She stayed with Camille for 3 weeks. She did not tell Camille everything, but she told her enough. Camille, to her credit, did not offer a verdict. She provided a spare room and coffee in the mornings, and the particular mercy of not asking the same questions twice. Natalie found in those weeks that her internal account of what had happened kept shifting. In the first days, she told herself it was survival logic, that anyone who'd come from where she'd come from would have done the same, maintained the same emergency exit, kept the same quiet pocket of self-preservation. This was not entirely false. What it left out was the sustained nature of it, the choice repeated over years not to close the door she'd built. A specific moment. She could place it. It was a Thursday, 18 months after they were married, when she'd decided to keep it open rather than tell him it existed. She thought about that Thursday sometimes, lying in Camille's guest room in the dark. What she'd weighed, what she'd decided. She'd told herself it would protect Julian if things ever went sideways. She understood now, with the clarity that comes from things having actually gone sideways, that she'd been protecting herself from the vulnerability of needing only one exit. Julian called a therapist he'd seen briefly 8 years ago after his father's death and made an appointment. The therapist was a compact, methodical man named Dr. Persons. Hale, who did not rush anything and had a way of asking questions that made Julian feel he'd thought of them himself. Did you see it coming? Dr. Hale asked during the second session. Not this specifically, but something. Julian paused. I think I chose not to ask directly because I didn't know which answer I was hoping for. What do you mean? I don't know if I wanted her to say everything was fine or to say it wasn't. He looked at his hands. I think I'd been tired for a while, and that's its own thing to sit with. He went back to the office. He received the dry patch near the fence. He made the pasta one night, alone for himself, and ate it at the kitchen island in the quiet. And it was neither consoling nor painful. It was just pasta. Natalie called after 5 weeks. They met at a coffee shop. neutral territory, her suggestion, which he appreciated. She had not made herself look better for this. She wore a gray sweater and sat with both hands around her mug and looked like someone who had not been sleeping quite enough. He found this more honest than if she'd composed herself carefully. "I've started talking to someone," she said. "So have I. I'm not asking to come back. I just wanted you to know that I understand more of what I did than I did when I said it." She glanced at him. "Is that meaningful to you, or is it just words?" "It's not just words," he said. "But I don't know yet what it is." She nodded. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. Outside, through the coffee shop window, people moved along the sidewalk in their coats, purposeful and anonymous. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how I could have just told you. Not the whole history, but the fear. I could have said, I need to know I can leave if I need to." "And maybe," Julian said, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the border of the conditional. She looked at him with something that was almost the expression he'd known best on her face. The expression she had when she was being entirely herself. No management, no presentation. He'd seen it rarely. "I'm sorry, Julian." "I know," he said. He meant it. He also knew that meaning it and knowing what to do with it were two very different things, and he wasn't ready to find out which one he had yet. They met 4 more times over the following months. Coffee once, dinner once, 2 walks along the river path west of the city. The dinners and walks were not reconciliation. They were something without a clear name. 2 people checking the wreckage together, trying to determine what, if anything, was still structural. By February, Julian had repainted the bedroom. Not for any symbolic reason. He would have said this and meant it. But because the paint had been scuffing for 2 years and he'd finally gotten around to it, he chose the same color. That, he supposed, meant something. Natalie had moved into an apartment in the Pearl District. Small, clean, hers in a way she hadn't had a place be hers in a long time. She had closed the accounts connected to Garrett. She had told Garrett in a call that lasted 11 minutes that she was ending all of it. He had been neither angry nor surprised. That, she found, was the saddest part of it. How prepared he'd always been for her to close the door on him, too. How little he'd expected otherwise. She had built a whole infrastructure of escape with a man who had already factored in her leaving. She sat with that for a long time. She went back to work. She did her job well, as she always had. She stopped tilting her phone screen. There was no phone to hide. The last time they met was April. Julian had called to say he'd found some of her books, a box she'd left in the hall closet, and she came on a Saturday morning to pick them up. He had coffee ready. She accepted a cup and they stood in the kitchen, the same island, though the light was different in spring, more direct, less forgiving in some ways and more in others. "How are you?" she asked. "Better," he said. "Genuinely." "You?" "Working on it." He nodded. She looked around the kitchen, slowly, without pretense. The way you look at a place you loved and are not sure you have the right to love anymore. The bird feeder was still crooked in the yard. He hadn't fixed it. "I think I always knew," she said, not about anything specific or about all of it, that eventually something I'd built to protect myself would be the thing that... She stopped. She wasn't looking for him to finish it. "I know," he said. The coffee was good. They stood in the quiet for a while. Not a painful quiet, not exactly. The kind that happens between people who have said everything that can be said and have arrived at the strange open country on the other side of that. She picked up the box of books. He held the door. "Take care of yourself, Natalie." She paused on the step, her back still slightly toward him. "You too, Julian." She walked down to her car. He stood in the doorway and watched her go, not with anguish, not with longing, but with the specific kind of attention he'd always paid to things, and noticing everything quality that she'd once called steady and later called distant, and which was, he understood now, simply the way he moved through the world, carefully and with both eyes open. He closed the door. He stood in the hall for a moment, his hand still on the knob, feeling the weight of the morning, the April light, the silence of the house, The box she hadn't left behind this time, the faint smell of coffee growing cold on the counter. Then he walked back to the kitchen and rinsed his cup. Outside, the crooked bird feeder swayed slightly in the wind. The reseeded patch near the fence had come in green. He hadn't fixed the feeder. He wasn't sure he was going to. Some things, he was learning, you leave the way you found them. Not from carelessness, not from giving up, but because straightening them would mean pretending the leaning never happened. And he was done, finally, with that kind of pretending. He put on his coat. He went outside. He stood in the yard for a while, just standing, just being a man in his yard on a Saturday morning in April, with all the ordinary weight of his life around him. It was enough. It was, at last, enough.